wind tore through the trees like a blade, and Adelina Voss fell to her knees in the snow, gasping for air that felt like ice in her lungs. Behind her, the gates of the only home she had ever known were closing, and no one inside had bothered to look back. Just an hour earlier, she had been sitting by the fire in her father's study, unaware that her entire life was about to be taken from her. Her stepbrother, Edmund, had walked in with a folder of papers and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You are not who you think you are," he had said, tossing the papers onto the table in front of her. "These documents prove it. You have no claim to this house, this name, or this family fortune." Adelina had stared at the papers, her hands trembling as she read lines she barely understood. Signatures, dates, claims that her mother had never truly been married to her father, that she was a child born outside of any legal union, that everything she believed about her own life was a lie. "This cannot be true," she had whispered. "It does not matter if it is true," Edmund had replied, his voice cold and steady. "It only matters what the courts believe, and they will believe me." Within the hour, 2 guards from the estate had escorted her to the front gates, placing a single bag in her hands, and nothing more. She had not even been allowed to take her mother's locket, the one item she treasured above all else. When she asked for it, Edmund had simply shaken his head and told her that everything inside that house, down to the smallest trinket, now belonged to him. Now, kneeling in the snow with the storm rising around her, Adelina understood that she had lost everything in a single afternoon. Her home, her name, her future. She forced herself to stand, wrapping her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, though it did little against the biting wind. The road ahead disappeared into a wall of white, and she had nowhere to go. No relatives who would take her in, no friends who could risk the wrath of a man as powerful as Edmund had suddenly become. Everyone she had once called family had turned their backs the moment her name was stripped away. She began to walk, one foot in front of the other, though she could no longer feel her toes inside her thin boots. The forest along the road groaned under the weight of the storm, branches cracking under snow and ice, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, though whether it was near or far she could not tell. Adelina thought of her mother, who had died when she was only 12, and wondered if this was some cruel echo of that loss, another person she loved being ripped away, except this time it was her own identity being buried in the snow behind her. Hours seemed to pass, though she could not be certain, since the gray sky gave no indication of whether it was still afternoon or already evening. Her steps grew slower, her thoughts grew hazy. She stumbled once, twice, and the third time she did not manage to catch herself before her knees hit the frozen ground. For a long moment, she considered simply staying there. The snow did not feel as cold as it had before. In fact, it felt strangely warm, wrapping around her like a blanket, and she wondered distantly if this was what dying felt like, a slow and gentle surrender, rather than the violent ending she had always imagined. Her eyelids grew heavy. The wind, which had howled so loudly only minutes before, now sounded soft and distant, like a lullaby sung from far away. She did not hear the horse's hooves at first. It was only when a shadow fell across her, blocking the swirling snow from her face, that she opened her eyes again. A massive black horse stood over her, its breath rising in great clouds, and atop it sat a man wrapped in a heavy dark cloak, his face mostly hidden beneath a hood. "Get up," the man said, his voice sharp and commanding, though there was something beneath the harshness that Adelina could not quite place. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her lips had gone numb. The man cursed under his breath and swung down from his horse, kneeling beside her in the snow. Up close, she could see hard, angular features, a jaw set with tension, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the little light left in the sky. He looked at her the way a soldier might look at an obstacle in his path, something to be dealt with quickly and without sentiment. "You will freeze to death out here," he said, more to himself than to her. "Foolish girl. What were you thinking, walking alone in a storm like this?" Adelina wanted to tell him that she had not chosen this, that she had been thrown out with nothing, that she had nowhere else to go, but her voice would not obey her. All she could manage was a weak shake of her head. The man studied her for a long moment, as if debating whether she was worth the trouble. Then, with a low sigh that sounded almost like frustration at himself, he lifted her from the snow, as though she weighed nothing at all, and set her onto his horse before climbing up behind her. "Hold on," he instructed, wrapping his own cloak around her shivering frame. "We are not far from the estate." Adelina barely had the strength to grip the horse's mane, let alone ask who this stranger was, or where he intended to take her. Her body had grown so cold that she could no longer tell where the snow ended and her own skin began. The last thing she remembered, before darkness took her, was the steady, powerful rhythm of the horse's gallop and the faint, unexpected warmth of the stranger's arm bracing her against his chest. When she woke again, it was to warmth, real warmth, the kind that came from a roaring fire rather than a dying memory of one. She was lying in a bed far grander than any she had known, covered in blankets, so thick and soft that for a moment she wondered if she had truly died, and this was some strange version of the afterlife. A woman with graying hair and kind eyes sat in a chair near the bed, and when she noticed Adelina stirring, she rose quickly. "There now," the woman said gently. "You are safe. You are at Ravenswood Hall." "Ravenswood," Adelina repeated, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar to her own ears. "Whose home is this?" The woman hesitated, glancing toward the door before answering. "This is the estate of His Grace, the Duke of Ashcombe." Adelina's breath caught. Even in her weakened state, she recognized that name. Everyone in the region knew of the Duke of Ashcombe, though few had ever met him in person. He was spoken of in hushed tones at dinner parties and market squares alike, a man whose battlefield victories were legendary, and whose personal coldness was equally infamous. Some called him ruthless. Others simply called him the Iron Duke, for it was said that nothing could soften him, not grief, not loss, not even the passage of time. "Why would he help someone like me?" Adelina asked, more to herself than to the woman before her. "That, my dear," the woman said with a small, knowing smile, "is a question I have been asking myself since he carried you through that door last night." Adelina tried to sit up, wincing as feeling slowly returned to her fingers and toes, an uncomfortable prickling sensation that told her she had come dangerously close to losing them entirely. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper of Ravenswood Hall, helped her adjust the pillows behind her back and brought a cup of warm broth to her lips. "Drink slowly," Mrs. Whitfield instructed. "Your body has been through a great deal." As the warmth of the broth spread through her, Adelina's mind drifted back to the events of the previous day, the betrayal, the cold walk through the storm, and finally the stranger who had lifted her from the snow, as though she were nothing more than a fallen branch in his path. She remembered his sharp voice, his dark eyes, and the strange gentleness hidden beneath his harsh exterior. "Where is he now?" she asked. "The Duke." "His Grace left early this morning, to attend to matters at the border," Mrs. Whitfield replied. "He does not often stay in one place for long. But he gave clear instructions that you were to be cared for and kept warm until he returned." "Did he say why he helped me?" Adelina pressed, unable to shake the memory of his cold, commanding tone, so at odds with the fact that he had stopped his horse for a stranger in a storm. Mrs. Whitfield's expression grew thoughtful. "His Grace does not explain himself to anyone, my dear, least of all to me. But in all my years serving this household, I have never once seen him stop for a stranger on the road. Whatever made him stop for you, I suspect even he does not fully understand it." Adelina lowered her eyes to the blankets pooled around her, trying to make sense of her situation. Only hours ago, she had been prepared to die alone in the snow, abandoned by everyone she had ever trusted. Now she found herself in the home of a man known throughout the land for his coldness, saved by his own hand, for reasons even his household could not explain. She thought of Edmund, of the papers he had thrown onto the table, of the guards who had escorted her out without so much as a backward glance. She thought of the locket she had been denied, the last piece of her mother she had left in the world. Anger began to stir beneath the exhaustion in her chest, a slow-burning ember that refused to be extinguished by grief alone. "I have nothing," she said quietly, almost to herself. "No home. No name, nothing but the clothes on my back, and even those are not truly mine anymore." Mrs. Whitfield reached out and gently patted her hand. "You have your life, my dear. That is more than you had last night. Everything else can be rebuilt, given time and the right circumstances." Adelina wanted to believe her, but the weight of everything she had lost pressed down on her chest like a stone. Still, some small part of her, a part she had not known existed until that moment, refused to give in to despair entirely. She had survived the storm. She had survived Edmund's betrayal. Whatever waited for her next, she intended to face it with her eyes open, rather than surrendering to the darkness that had nearly claimed her on that frozen road. Outside the window, the storm continued to rage, but within the walls of Ravenswood Hall, Adelina Voss began, for the first time since her world had collapsed around her, to imagine that perhaps not everything was lost after all. Somewhere out there, riding through that same storm, was a man whose reputation suggested he cared for no one, and yet whose actions had already begun to prove otherwise. She did not know what would happen when he returned, or what he intended for a stranger he had pulled from certain death, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that her story was far from over. As Mrs. Whitfield tucked the blankets more securely around her and moved to stoke the fire, Adelina closed her eyes, not in surrender this time, but in the first moments of true rest she had known in what felt like a lifetime. Whatever waited beyond the walls of Ravenswood Hall, whatever the Iron Duke intended when he returned, she would face it. For now, though, exhausted and safe within a stranger's care, she allowed herself to simply breathe, and to sleep, and to hope, however faintly, that the worst of the storm had already passed. Cassian Thorne, Duke of Ashcombe, rode through the border checkpoint, with snow still clinging to his shoulders, his mind far from the woman he had left sleeping in his own bed the night before. He had matters of far greater importance to attend to, or so he told himself, though the image of her pale face against the white ground kept intruding on his thoughts, no matter how hard he tried to push it away. "You look troubled, Your Grace," said Captain Nathaniel Vane, his second in command, as they walked their horses side by side toward the border garrison. "That is unusual for you." "I am not troubled," Cassian replied curtly. "I am tired. The storm delayed our progress by half a day." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow but said nothing further. He had served under Cassian for nearly 6 years, long enough to recognize when his commander was avoiding a subject rather than dismissing it entirely. Still, he knew better than to press the Iron Duke on matters he did not wish to discuss. They spent the better part of the morning inspecting the garrison, reviewing reports of skirmishes along the disputed territory to the north, and meeting with local officials who wanted assurance that the Duke's forces would continue to protect the region through the winter months. Cassian handled each matter with his usual efficiency, his voice flat and businesslike, his expression unreadable to anyone who did not know him well. But even as he reviewed maps and listened to reports, some part of his mind kept drifting back to Ravenswood Hall, to the woman he had found nearly frozen on the road, to the strange impulse that had made him stop his horse when every instinct honed by years of battle told him to keep riding. He was not a man who acted on impulse. He had built his entire life around control, around calculation, around never allowing sentiment to interfere with duty. Yet something about the sight of her, collapsed in the snow, abandoned and alone, had cut through years of careful discipline in a matter of seconds. "Your Grace," one of the local officials said, drawing his attention back to the present, "will you be staying through the week to oversee the reinforcement of the eastern wall?" "No," Cassian answered, perhaps too quickly. "I have matters requiring my attention at Ravenswood. Captain Vane will remain to oversee the reinforcement in my absence." Nathaniel glanced at him with poorly concealed curiosity, but said nothing, until they were alone again, walking their horses back toward the stables. "Matters requiring your attention," Nathaniel repeated slowly. "Might I ask what matters, exactly, given that you left the border less than a day after arriving?" "You may ask," Cassian said, "but I am not obligated to answer." Nathaniel chuckled. A rare sound given the Duke's usual demeanor did not invite humor. "Fair enough. Though I will say, in 6 years of service, I have never once seen you cut short an inspection, for reasons you refuse to explain." Cassian did not respond, though his jaw tightened slightly, a small tell that Nathaniel had long ago learned to recognize as evidence that he had struck closer to the truth than the Duke would ever admit aloud. The truth, though Cassian would not have spoken it even under torture, was that he could not stop thinking about the woman's eyes, wide and terrified, even as her body succumbed to the cold, and the way she had looked at him, not with fear, as most people did, but with something closer to desperate hope. No one looked at him that way. People feared him, respected him, obeyed him. But hope was not an emotion he typically inspired in anyone, and the fact that a dying stranger had looked at him as though he might be her salvation had unsettled something deep within him that he had thought long buried. He thought of Isabel, though he tried not to, as he always tried not to when memories of his late wife threatened to surface. It had been nearly 4 years since her death, 4 years since he had allowed himself to feel much of anything beyond duty and discipline. He had built walls around his heart so thick that even his closest advisors believed him incapable of warmth. It was easier that way, safer. A man who felt nothing could not be hurt again. And yet, by mid-afternoon, Cassian had made his excuses to the remaining officials and set out on the long ride back toward Ravenswood Hall, leaving Nathaniel in charge of the border garrison, despite the captain's poorly hidden amusement at his commander's sudden urgency to return home. The ride back took the better part of the day, the storm having finally passed, leaving behind a landscape of pristine white snow that stretched endlessly in every direction. Cassian pushed his horse harder than he probably should have, telling himself repeatedly that his haste was simply a matter of ensuring the household ran smoothly in his absence, that it had nothing to do with the stranger he had found collapsed on the road. He did not entirely believe his own reasoning, but it was easier than confronting the alternative. When he finally arrived at Ravenswood Hall, dusk had settled over the estate, casting long shadows across the snow-covered grounds. He handed his horse to a waiting stable hand and strode into the main hall, where Mrs. Whitfield met him with a look of mild surprise. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying quickly. "We did not expect you back so soon." "Is she awake?" Cassian asked, his tone clipped, though he immediately regretted the eagerness that had slipped into his voice. Mrs. Whitfield's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of understanding passing behind her eyes before she composed herself. "She woke earlier this afternoon, Your Grace. She has taken some broth and rested since. I believe she is recovering well, all things considered." "Good," Cassian said, removing his gloves with sharp, efficient movements. "I wish to see her." "Of course, Your Grace. Though I should mention, she has many questions." "I imagine she does," Cassian replied dryly. "Most people do, when they find themselves in the home of a stranger." He made his way through the familiar corridors of Ravenswood Hall, past portraits of ancestors long dead, and tapestries that had hung on these walls for generations, until he reached the guest chamber, where Adelina had been settled. He paused outside the door for a moment longer than he intended, questioning why his heart beat faster than it had any right to, before finally pushing the door open. Adelina sat propped against a stack of pillows, color having returned to her cheeks, though shadows of exhaustion still lingered beneath her eyes. When she saw him enter, she straightened immediately, her expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. "You came back," she said. "It is my home," Cassian replied, more sharply than he intended. "Where else would I go?" Adelina's chin lifted slightly at his tone, a flash of spirit returning to her gaze despite everything she had endured. "I only meant that I did not expect to see you so soon. Your housekeeper mentioned you had matters at the border." "Matters that can wait," Cassian said, before he could stop himself, immediately wishing he had chosen different words. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Cassian stood near the door, arms crossed, his posture rigid with the same discipline he applied to every aspect of his life, while Adelina studied him with an expression he could not quite decipher, somewhere between gratitude and wariness. "Thank you," she finally said, "for what you did. I do not know what would have happened if you had not stopped." "You would have died," Cassian said bluntly. "There is no need to speak around it." Adelina flinched slightly at his directness, but did not look away. "Even so, thank you." Cassian nodded once, uncertain how to respond to gratitude he had not sought and did not feel he deserved. He had acted on instinct, nothing more, and the fact that his instinct had led him to save a stranger's life did not make him deserving of thanks in his own estimation. "You should rest," he said finally, turning to leave. "Mrs. Whitfield will see to whatever you require." "Wait," Adelina said, and something in her voice, some undercurrent of desperation carefully controlled, made him pause. "May I ask why you helped me? You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Cassian turned back to face her, considering the question longer than he expected to. The honest answer, that he did not fully understand his own actions. That something about her collapsed form in the snow had cut through years of careful indifference, was not one he was prepared to speak aloud. "I do not leave people to die on my land," he said instead, his tone flat and final. "That is all." He left, before she could press further, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary, and stood in the corridor for a long moment, breathing slowly, trying to steady the strange, unfamiliar rhythm his heart had adopted since the moment he had lifted her from the snow. Whatever this was, whatever strange pull had brought him back to Ravenswood Hall faster than duty required, he intended to bury it beneath duty and discipline, just as he had buried every other inconvenient feeling since Isabel's death. He was the Iron Duke. He did not allow himself to feel, and yet, as he made his way back down the corridor, he found himself already thinking of tomorrow, of seeing her again, of the strange warmth that had stirred in his chest, despite every effort to suppress it. 3 days passed before Adelina felt strong enough to leave her bed for more than a few minutes at a time, and in that period, she came to know Ravenswood Hall, not through the Duke himself, who remained largely absent from her days, but through the quiet kindness of Mrs. Whitfield and the curious glances of the household staff, who whispered among themselves whenever they thought she could not hear. "They say His Grace has never brought a stranger into this house," she overheard one young maid whisper to another, as they changed the linens in the hall outside her room. "Not once. Not even after the mistress passed." "Hush," the other maid replied. "You will get us both dismissed, if he hears you gossiping." Adelina pretended not to have heard, though the words lingered in her mind, long after the maids had moved on to their other duties. The mistress. She wondered, not for the first time, about the woman in the portrait Cassian had stared at that first night, the one whose face bore an expression of quiet sorrow that seemed to have been captured perfectly by whatever artist had painted her. On the 4th day, feeling stronger than she had since her arrival, Adelina decided to venture beyond her room for the first time. She dressed in a simple gown that Mrs. Whitfield had provided, far plainer than anything she had once owned but infinitely more comfortable than the fine silks she had worn as a pampered heiress, and made her way slowly down the main staircase of Ravenswood Hall. The estate was even grander than she had realized from the confines of her room. High ceilings stretched overhead, decorated with intricate moldings that spoke of generations of wealth and careful craftsmanship. Portraits lined the walls of the main hall, depicting men and women who shared the same sharp, angular features she had come to associate with Cassian himself. Generations of Ashcombe dukes and duchesses staring down at her, with expressions ranging from solemn to severe. She paused before one portrait in particular, drawn by something in the woman's gentle smile that stood in stark contrast to the sternness of the surrounding paintings. The woman had soft brown hair and kind eyes, and there was a warmth to her expression that seemed almost out of place among the austere Ashcombe lineage. "That is the late Duchess," a voice said from behind her, and Adelina turned to find Mrs. Whitfield approaching, a tray of tea balanced carefully in her hands. "Lady Isabel. She passed nearly 4 years ago now, giving birth to a child who did not survive either." Adelina's breath caught. "I did not know. His Grace never mentioned a wife." "He does not speak of her," Mrs. Whitfield said quietly, setting down the tray on a nearby table. "Not to anyone. But I have served this household since before their marriage, and I can tell you, my dear, he was not always the man you see now. There was a time when he laughed easily, when he smiled without effort, when this house was filled with warmth rather than silence." "What happened?" Adelina asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "Grief happened," Mrs. Whitfield replied simply. "Grief. And the belief that if he never allowed himself to feel anything again, he could never be hurt so deeply a second time. It is not an uncommon response, though it has cost him a great deal over the years. Friends, warmth, the simple pleasures of an ordinary life." Adelina looked back at the portrait, at Isabel's gentle smile, and felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for the man she had initially assumed was simply cold by nature. There was more to Cassian Thorne than his reputation suggested, more than the harsh, clipped tones he had used with her since her arrival, and she found herself wondering what it might take to see the man Mrs. Whitfield described, the one who had once laughed easily and smiled without effort. "Does he still grieve her?" Adelina asked. "In his own way," Mrs. Whitfield said, though I sometimes think the grief has become as much a habit as a genuine feeling. He has worn his sorrow like armor for so long that I wonder if he remembers how to remove it, even when the battle it was meant to protect him from has long since ended. They continued walking through the halls together, Mrs. Whitfield pointing out various rooms and sharing small anecdotes about the estate's history, while Adelina listened with growing fascination. It was strange, she thought, how quickly her circumstances had shifted from certain death in a snowstorm to genuine curiosity about the life of a man she barely knew. That evening, as she sat alone in the small library adjoining her guest chamber, flipping through the pages of a book without truly reading them, she heard footsteps approaching and looked up to find Cassian standing in the doorway, still dressed in his riding clothes, snow clinging to his boots. "Mrs. Whitfield tells me you are recovering well," he said, his tone as clipped and businesslike as it had been during their previous conversations. "I am," Adelina confirmed, "thanks to your household's care." Cassian nodded, though he made no move to enter the room fully, remaining instead in the doorway, as though maintaining some careful distance between them. "I have been considering your situation," he said after a moment. "You cannot remain here indefinitely without some explanation for your presence, nor can you return to whatever circumstances led you to the road that night, given what you have told Mrs. Whitfield about your stepbrother." Adelina's hands tightened slightly around the book in her lap. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted quietly. "Everyone I once considered family has turned against me. Even if I wish to fight Edmund's claims, I have no resources, no allies, nothing but my own word, against forged documents, and a man who has clearly planned this deception for some time." "I am aware," Cassian said, "which is why I have a proposition for you. One I believe may benefit us both, though I understand if you require time to consider it." Adelina's curiosity, momentarily overriding her exhaustion, drew her attention fully to the man standing in the doorway. "What sort of proposition?" Cassian hesitated, an unusual pause for a man typically so direct in his speech. "Not tonight," he said finally. "You are still recovering, and this is not a decision to be made in haste. Rest. We will speak further when you have regained more of your strength." Before she could press him further, he had already turned and departed, leaving her alone once more, with her thoughts and an unread book still open in her lap. She stared at the empty doorway for a long moment, wondering what sort of proposition a man like Cassian Thorne might offer a woman with nothing left to her name, and found herself, despite everything she had endured, genuinely curious to hear his answer. The following days passed in a similar pattern, Cassian appearing briefly each evening to inquire after her recovery, their conversations remaining polite but distant, both of them circling around whatever proposition he had mentioned, without either fully broaching the subject again. Adelina found herself watching for his return each day, with an anticipation she did not entirely understand, given how brief and businesslike their interactions remained. It was nearly a week after her arrival, on an evening when the storm outside had finally given way to clear, star-filled skies, that Cassian finally invited her to join him in his study, a room she had not yet been permitted to enter during her time at Ravenswood Hall. The study was smaller than she had expected, lined with books and maps rather than the ornate decorations that filled the rest of the estate, and a fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across Cassian's face as he gestured for her to take a seat across from his desk. "I imagine you have wondered about the proposition I mentioned," he began, his tone carefully measured. "I have thought of little else," Adelina admitted. Cassian nodded, folding his hands atop the desk. "As you are aware, your stepbrother has taken measures to ensure you have no legal standing to reclaim your inheritance or your family name. Fighting such claims alone, without resources or allies, would likely prove futile, regardless of the truth behind them." "I am aware," Adelina said, a note of bitterness creeping into her voice, despite her best efforts to suppress it. "However," Cassian continued, "as Duke of Ashcombe, I possess considerable resources and influence, more than sufficient to challenge fraudulent claims of the sort your stepbrother has presumably filed. I could ensure your name and inheritance were restored, given time and proper legal maneuvering." Adelina's heart began to race, though she forced herself to remain outwardly composed. "Why would you offer such assistance? You owe me nothing." "I require something in return," Cassian said bluntly. "I require an heir, and given certain circumstances, I do not intend to elaborate upon. I have concluded that a marriage of convenience would serve my purposes far better than the alternative options typically available to a man in my position. Adelina stared at him, momentarily too stunned to respond. You are proposing marriage. I am proposing an arrangement, Cassian corrected. One that benefits us both. You would receive my full support in reclaiming your name and inheritance, along with the protection and status afforded by the title of Duchess. I would receive a legitimate heir and the social advantages of an appropriate marriage, without the complications of genuine romantic entanglement, which I have no interest in pursuing. The bluntness of his proposal, delivered with all the emotional warmth of a business transaction, struck Adelina as both insulting and, in its own strange way, oddly comforting. There was no pretense here, no false declarations of affection meant to manipulate her into agreement. He was offering exactly what he claimed to offer, nothing more and nothing less. And if I refuse, she asked, then I will still assist you in reclaiming your inheritance, to whatever extent I am able, though I cannot guarantee the same level of resources or urgency without the arrangement in place, Cassian said honestly. The choice remains entirely yours. Adelina considered his words carefully, weighing the practical benefits of his proposal against the strange discomfort of entering marriage with a man who had explicitly stated his disinterest in genuine affection. Yet what other options remained to her? Alone, penniless, and disgraced, she had little hope of reclaiming anything Edmund had stolen from her. I will consider your proposal, she said finally. Cassian nodded, apparently satisfied with her response, though something flickered briefly across his expression that Adelina could not quite identify, gone before she could examine it further. Take whatever time you require, he said, though I would ask that you reach a decision before the month's end, as certain legal matters would benefit from prompt attention. As Adelina rose to leave the study, her mind already racing through the implications of his proposal, she could not shake the feeling that whatever she decided, her life was about to change once again, perhaps as dramatically as it had the night Edmund had thrown her from her family home into the frozen storm. Word of Adelina's presence at Ravenswood Hall spread through the county faster than she could have anticipated, carried by servants who traveled between estates, by merchants who supplied the household, and by the simple truth that a duke as private as Cassian Thorne rarely welcomed anyone into his home, let alone a woman whose circumstances remained shrouded in mystery. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a letter, delivered to Ravenswood Hall by a courier bearing the seal of a family Adelina recognized immediately as friends of her stepbrother. Mrs. Whitfield brought the letter to her with a troubled expression, having apparently already read enough of its contents to know it would not bring good news. Adelina broke the seal with trembling fingers and read through the letter twice before the full weight of its message settled over her. It was from Lady Beatrice Ashford, a distant cousin of her stepbrother, warning her in carefully veiled language that continued association with the Duke of Ashcombe would only deepen the scandal already attached to her name, that rumors had already begun circulating regarding accusations of theft and deception on Adelina's part, accusations that painted her not as a victim of Edmund's cruelty, but as a schemer who had fabricated her own sympathetic story to manipulate a grieving widower. They are calling me a thief, Adelina said aloud, her voice hollow with disbelief. Edmund has convinced everyone that I stole from my own family, that the papers proving my illegitimacy were fabricated by me, in an attempt to escape punishment for crimes I never committed. Mrs. Whitfield's expression darkened. Your stepbrother sounds like a man skilled in the art of deception, my dear. It would not surprise me if he anticipated exactly this sort of situation, and prepared his lies accordingly. Adelina crumpled the letter in her fist, anger and fear warring within her chest. If society at large believed Edmund's version of events, believed that she was a thief and a schemer rather than the victim she truly was, then any hope of reclaiming her inheritance through legal means, even with Cassian's considerable resources, would become infinitely more complicated. She found Cassian in his study later that evening, still working through a stack of correspondence by candlelight, and set the crumpled letter before him without preamble. Read this, she said. I believe you should understand the full scope of what accepting your proposal might entail. Cassian smoothed out the letter and read through it in silence, his expression growing increasingly severe with each line. When he finished, he set it aside and looked up at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Your stepbrother is more calculating than I initially believed, he said. This is not merely an attempt to steal your inheritance. He is actively working to destroy your reputation, beyond repair, ensuring that even if you reclaimed your legal standing, society would never fully accept you again. What does this mean for your proposal? Adelina asked, bracing herself for him to withdraw the offer entirely, given the additional complications now attached to her situation. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, studying the letter as though searching for something within its carefully crafted lies. It means, he said finally, that this will be a more difficult battle than I initially anticipated. But it does not change my proposal. If anything, it strengthens my resolve to see your stepbrother's deceptions exposed for what they are. Adelina stared at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. Why would you take on such a battle? Marrying me was already a significant commitment on your part. This additional scandal only complicates matters further. Because, Cassian said, his voice hardening with something that sounded almost like genuine anger, I have little patience for men who prey upon those weaker than themselves, particularly when they hide behind forged documents and manufactured lies, rather than facing their victims honestly. Your stepbrother's actions offend me on a level that has nothing to do with our arrangement. His words, delivered with unexpected passion, struck Adelina more deeply than she expected. This was not the cold, businesslike Duke who had proposed marriage as a mere transaction days earlier. This was a man genuinely troubled by injustice, willing to take on additional risk and complication, simply because he found Edmund's actions morally reprehensible. Thank you, she said quietly, for taking this seriously. Cassian waved off her gratitude with a slight shake of his head. Have you reached a decision regarding my proposal? Adelina considered the question, weighing everything she had learned about Cassian in the days since her arrival. His hidden grief, his surprising sense of justice beneath his cold exterior, the genuine care he had shown despite his initial claims of indifference. Whatever this marriage would be, whatever complications lay ahead in reclaiming her name and inheritance, she found herself believing, perhaps for the first time since Edmund's betrayal, that she was not entirely alone in this fight. I accept, she said. I will marry you, Your Grace, under the terms you have outlined. Something shifted in Cassian's expression, a flicker of relief perhaps, or something deeper that he did not allow himself to fully express. Then we shall proceed accordingly, he said. I will have my solicitors begin preparing the necessary documents immediately, along with a formal investigation into your stepbrother's claims. Over the following days, Ravenswood Hall transformed from a quiet estate into a hub of activity, with solicitors and investigators arriving regularly to discuss strategy with Cassian, while Adelina found herself increasingly drawn into these discussions, her first-hand knowledge of her family's affairs proving invaluable in identifying weaknesses in Edmund's fabricated claims. Your stepbrother filed these documents with unusual haste, said one solicitor, a sharp-eyed man named Percival Ashworth, who had been retained specifically for his expertise in matters of inheritance law. Typically, such claims require extensive documentation gathered over months, if not years. The speed with which he produced these papers suggests either remarkable foresight or, more likely, a hasty fabrication that may contain inconsistencies we can exploit. What sort of inconsistencies? Cassian asked. Dates, for one, Percival replied, spreading several documents across the desk. The marriage certificate, he claims, proves your mother was never legally wed to your father, bears a date that conflicts with parish records. I have already begun reviewing. If I can obtain the original parish register, we may be able to prove this document was fabricated entirely. Adelina leaned forward, studying the papers with renewed hope. How quickly could you obtain such records? With His Grace's resources at my disposal, Percival said, glancing toward Cassian. Perhaps within a fortnight. The investigation proceeded with remarkable speed, Cassian's wealth and influence opening doors that would have remained firmly closed to Adelina alone. Yet even as evidence began mounting in her favor, Edmund proved himself a formidable adversary, countering each discovery with new fabrications, spreading additional rumors through the county to further tarnish Adelina's reputation before the truth could fully emerge. He grows desperate, Percival observed one evening, as they reviewed the latest developments. Desperate men make mistakes. We simply need to remain patient and thorough in our approach. Adelina found herself growing increasingly impatient, despite Percival's advice, each day bringing new whispers and rumors that threatened to undo whatever progress they made. Yet through it all, Cassian remained steadfast, his commitment to exposing Edmund's deceptions never wavering, even as the personal cost to his own reputation began to mount alongside hers. "They are calling you a fool," she overheard one evening, standing outside his study, as two of his advisors discussed the situation, in hushed but audible tones. "A man of your standing, entangling yourself with a woman of such questionable reputation. It reflects poorly on the Ashcombe name." "His Grace's decisions are his own to make," came Percival's reply, firm and unwavering. "And in this instance, I believe his judgment is entirely sound, regardless of what county gossip might suggest." Adelina retreated from the doorway before either man noticed her presence, her chest tight with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Cassian was risking his own reputation, built over years of careful discipline and battlefield achievement, simply to see justice done on her behalf. Whatever this arrangement between them had begun as, she found herself increasingly aware that it had grown into something far more complex than either of them had initially anticipated. That night, she sought him out in his study once more, finding him alone, staring into the fire with an expression of weary determination. "You are risking a great deal for someone you barely know," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Cassian looked up, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch once again, as it so often did in his presence. "Perhaps," he said, "but some battles are worth fighting, regardless of the personal cost involved. Your stepbrother's cruelty deserves to be exposed, whatever the consequences to my own reputation." "Why does it matter so much to you?" Adelina pressed, genuinely curious about the depths of conviction he displayed on her behalf. "You could have simply provided minimal assistance and moved forward with our arrangement, without this level of personal investment." Cassian was quiet for a long moment, his expression shifting through several emotions Adelina could not fully identify before settling into something that looked almost like vulnerability, an expression she had not yet witnessed from the typically stoic Duke. "I know what it feels like," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, "to lose everything that matters in a single moment, to have the world you believed in collapse without warning. I will not stand by and allow another person to suffer that same fate, without doing everything within my power to prevent it, particularly when the person responsible acts with such calculated cruelty." Adelina understood, without him needing to elaborate further, that he was speaking not only of her circumstances, but of his own grief, of Isabel's death, and whatever loss had transformed him into the guarded, disciplined man he had become. In that moment, watching the firelight flicker across his carefully controlled features, she felt something shift within her own chest, a warmth she had not expected to feel toward a man who had initially proposed marriage as nothing more than a practical arrangement. Whatever this was becoming between them, she realized, it was no longer merely a transaction. And as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting shadows across the study where they sat in comfortable silence, Adelina found herself hoping, for reasons she did not yet fully understand, that this fragile connection between them might one day grow into something far more meaningful than either of them had originally intended. The wedding took place quietly, without the grand celebrations typically expected of a ducal marriage, held instead in the small chapel adjoining Ravenswood Hall, with only Mrs. Whitfield, Percival Ashworth, and a handful of trusted staff members in attendance. Adelina wore a simple gown of pale blue, far less ornate than the wedding dress she might once have imagined for herself, back when her future had still seemed certain and secure. Cassian stood beside her throughout the brief ceremony, his expression carefully neutral, though Adelina noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the barely perceptible tightness around his eyes that suggested this moment affected him more deeply than his composed exterior revealed. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Cassian took her hand briefly, his touch gentle despite the calluses she felt against her palm, evidence of years spent wielding weapons in battle, rather than the soft comforts of court life. "It is done," he said quietly, once the small gathering had dispersed, and they found themselves alone in the chapel's fading candlelight. "You are now Duchess of Ashcombe, whatever else society may believe about your circumstances." "Thank you," Adelina said, though the word felt inadequate given everything he had sacrificed and risked on her behalf. "For all of this, I do not know how I will ever repay such kindness. There is no debt between us, Cassian replied, his tone firm. We have entered into an agreement that benefits us both. You need not feel indebted to me for honoring my own commitments. Yet even as he spoke the words, Adelina sensed something beneath his careful composure, some deeper feeling he refused to acknowledge even to himself. She had spent enough time in his company over the preceding weeks to recognize the small signs of emotion he worked so hard to suppress. The way his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than strictly necessary. The way his voice softened almost imperceptibly when he believed she was not paying close attention. Their new life together settled into a comfortable, if somewhat formal, routine. Cassian continued his duties as Duke, overseeing matters both at Ravenswood Hall and at the border territories, where his military expertise remained in constant demand, while Adelina worked alongside Percival Ashworth to continue building their case against Edmund's fraudulent claims. In the evenings, they often found themselves together in Cassian's study, discussing the day's developments over tea, their conversations gradually growing less formal and more genuine with each passing week. Percival believes we have found the evidence we need, Cassian informed her one evening, several weeks into their marriage, as they reviewed a stack of documents Percival had delivered earlier that day. The parish register confirms your parents' marriage, predates the documents Edmund provided by several years. His fabrication is exposed. Adelina felt a surge of hope she had not allowed herself to fully experience since the night Edmund had thrown her from her family home. Then we can proceed with reclaiming my inheritance? We can, Cassian confirmed, though your stepbrother will not surrender without a fight. Men like him rarely accept defeat gracefully, particularly when their schemes are exposed publicly. As if summoned by their very discussion, a letter arrived the following morning, bearing Edmund's own seal, its contents making clear that he had learned of their marriage and the investigation threatening his fraudulent claims. The letter contained veiled threats against both Adelina's reputation and Cassian's standing, suggesting that further pursuit of this matter would result in consequences neither of them would appreciate. He grows desperate, Cassian observed, reading through the letter with a frown. Desperation makes men reckless. We should proceed with caution, but also with confidence that his threats carry little actual weight against the evidence we have gathered. Despite his reassurances, Adelina found herself increasingly anxious as the weeks progressed, aware that Edmund's desperation might manifest in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. She began spending more time within the confines of Ravenswood Hall, venturing into the wider county less frequently, uncertain whether Edmund's threats extended beyond mere words. It was during this period of heightened tension that Adelina first noticed a genuine shift in Cassian's behavior toward her, subtle at first, but growing increasingly evident with each passing day. He began seeking her company more frequently, not merely for discussions related to their legal battle against Edmund, but simply for conversation, for the quiet companionship that had gradually developed between them despite the practical origins of their arrangement. One evening, as autumn gave way to the deepening chill of early winter, mirroring almost exactly the season in which they had first met nearly a year earlier, Cassian found her in the small library adjoining her chambers, curled into a chair near the fire with a book resting unopened in her lap. You seem troubled, he observed, settling into the chair across from her, without waiting for invitation, a familiarity that had grown naturally between them over the preceding months. I keep thinking of Edmund's threats, Adelina admitted. What if he attempts something beyond mere rumors and legal maneuvering? What if he tries to harm you, given your involvement in exposing his deceptions? Something in Cassian's expression softened at her words, a warmth she had witnessed only rarely since their marriage, typically in unguarded moments when he believed himself unobserved. You need not concern yourself with my safety, he said. I have faced far greater threats on the battlefield than whatever your stepbrother might attempt. That does not mean I cannot worry, Adelina replied, surprising herself with the honesty of her admission. You have risked so much on my behalf. I would not forgive myself if harm came to you, because of decisions I made. Cassian studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his dark eyes that Adelina could not quite identify, though it made her breath catch nonetheless. Adelina, he said, using her given name rather than the formal address he typically employed. I did not enter this arrangement purely out of obligation, whatever I may have claimed initially. Your safety, your well-being, These matters concern me far more deeply than I initially anticipated when I first proposed this marriage." The admission, quiet but genuine, settled something within Adelina's chest that she had not realized remained unsettled until that very moment. She had suspected, over the preceding weeks, that Cassian's feelings toward her had evolved beyond the practical arrangement they had originally agreed upon. But hearing him acknowledge it directly, however briefly, felt like watching ice crack beneath the surface of a frozen lake, revealing warmer waters flowing steadily beneath. "I feel the same," she admitted quietly. "Whatever this began as, it has become something more to me as well." Neither of them moved to bridge the physical distance, still separating them. Both too accustomed to careful restraint to act on the tentative acknowledgement they had just shared. Yet something had fundamentally shifted between them in that quiet exchange, a foundation laid for whatever might grow between them in the months to come. "I should return to my correspondence," Cassian said eventually, though he made no immediate move to leave, lingering instead, as though reluctant to break whatever fragile connection had formed between them. "Percival expects updated documents by morning." "Of course," Adelina said, though she found herself equally reluctant to see him go. As Cassian finally rose and made his way toward the door, he paused briefly, glancing back at her with an expression she had rarely witnessed from him, something almost tender beneath his usual careful composure. "Adelina," he said, "whatever comes from Edmund's threats, whatever battles lie ahead in reclaiming your inheritance, know that you are not facing them alone. Not anymore." He departed before she could respond, leaving her alone once more with her thoughts, though this time, rather than the loneliness and despair that had characterized her circumstances since Edmund's betrayal, she felt something entirely different settling within her chest, a warmth and hope she had not expected to experience again after everything she had endured. Outside the library window, snow had begun to fall once more, echoing the storm that had first brought them together nearly a year earlier. Yet this time, rather than facing the cold alone, Adelina found herself surrounded by the quiet warmth of Ravenswood Hall, and increasingly, by feelings toward its master that she had never anticipated when she first accepted his practical proposal of marriage. The invitation arrived on a cold morning in early winter, bearing the royal seal of the Capitol Court, summoning both Cassian and Adelina to attend a gathering hosted by the king's own council, an event that would mark Adelina's first formal appearance in society since her marriage to the Duke of Ashcombe. "We cannot avoid this indefinitely," Cassian said, studying the invitation with a troubled expression. "Refusing a summons from the royal court would raise far more questions than attending, particularly given the rumors already circulating regarding your circumstances." "I understand," Adelina replied, though anxiety twisted in her stomach at the prospect of facing society's judgment directly, rather than through the safety of rumors and whispered gossip that had characterized her experience thus far. "You need not face this alone," Cassian said, his voice firm with the same protective conviction he had displayed throughout their ongoing battle against Edmund's schemes. "I will be beside you throughout the entire evening, and Percival has prepared additional evidence we can present if your stepbrother attempts to raise his accusations publicly." Despite his reassurances, Adelina spent the days leading up to the royal gathering in a state of near-constant anxiety, aware that Edmund would likely attend as well, given his own social standing and connections within the capital's aristocratic circles. The thought of facing him directly, after months of fighting his fabricated claims through legal channels alone, filled her with a complicated mixture of fear and determination. The evening of the gathering arrived with a chill that seemed to seep into every corner of the grand hall where the royal court had assembled. Adelina wore a gown of deep burgundy that Cassian had commissioned specifically for the occasion, its rich color and elegant design a stark contrast to the simple clothing she had worn during her recovery at Ravenswood Hall months earlier. "You look every bit the Duchess you have become," Cassian said quietly, as they made their way into the crowded hall, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back. "Thank you," Adelina replied, though her attention remained fixed on scanning the crowd for any sign of Edmund among the assembled guests. She did not have to search long. Edmund appeared within the first hour of the gathering, resplendent in fine clothing that suggested her family's fortune, stolen through his deceptions, had served him well in the months since her exile. He approached with a confident smile that did not reach his eyes, the same expression she remembered from the day he had thrown her from their family home. "Adelina," he said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "How wonderful to see you looking so well. Marriage to a duke clearly agrees with you." "Edmund," Adelina replied, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the anger simmering beneath her carefully maintained composure. "I trust you are prepared to answer for the fraudulent documents you filed against me." A flicker of something passed behind Edmund's eyes, quickly masked by his practiced smile. "I do not know what you mean. Whatever accusations you have concocted with your new husband's resources, I assure you, the truth remains firmly on my side." Cassian stepped forward slightly, his presence a solid protective wall beside Adelina. "The truth, as it happens, has already been established, through the parish records your fabricated documents failed to account for," he said, his voice carrying the cold authority that had earned him his reputation throughout the realm. "I would advise caution in whatever further deceptions you intend to pursue, given the evidence already in our possession." Edmund's smile faltered momentarily before he recovered, though his eyes now carried a harder edge that suggested genuine concern beneath his performance of confidence. "Evidence can be fabricated as easily as accusations, Your Grace. I would be careful about the claims you choose to support so publicly." Before either could respond further, a herald's voice rang through the hall, announcing that the king's chief magistrate wished to address several matters of legal dispute that had been brought before the court's attention, including, to Adelina's shock, the very inheritance dispute between herself and Edmund. "It seems," Cassian murmured quietly, as they were ushered toward the front of the assembled crowd, along with Edmund and his own retinue of solicitors, "that Percival's petitions to the crown have finally borne fruit sooner than we anticipated." The chief magistrate, an elderly man with sharp eyes that missed little, called for silence before addressing the gathered court regarding the matter of the Voss family inheritance, outlining the conflicting claims presented by both Adelina and Edmund regarding the legitimacy of her birth and subsequent rights to her family's fortune. "Present your evidence," the magistrate instructed, and Percival stepped forward on Adelina's behalf, presenting the parish records that definitively proved her parents' marriage predated the documents Edmund had fabricated, along with sworn testimony from witnesses who had attended the original ceremony decades earlier. Edmund's solicitors attempted a counter-argument, presenting their own documents and questioning the authenticity of the parish records Percival had obtained, but the magistrate's expression grew increasingly skeptical as the evidence mounted against Edmund's claims. "These parish records," the magistrate said finally, addressing the entire assembled court, "bear the seal and signature of the presiding clergyman at the time, verified independently by 3 separate witnesses still living within the county. I find the evidence overwhelming in favor of the Duchess of Ashcomb's legitimate claim to her family's inheritance." A murmur swept through the assembled crowd, and Adelina felt a surge of vindication so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Months of fear and uncertainty finally beginning to lift beneath the weight of official confirmation that she had been telling the truth all along. Edmund, however, was not prepared to accept defeat so easily. "This is absurd," he protested, his composed facade finally cracking beneath the pressure of public exposure. "These records could easily have been forged by the Duke's own resources, purchased through his considerable wealth and influence." "Careful, Mr. Voss," the magistrate warned, his tone sharp with authority. "Accusations of forgery against a duke of the realm, without substantial evidence to support such claims, constitute a serious offense in their own right." Edmund's face paled slightly, though he attempted to maintain his composure, despite the mounting evidence against him. "I merely suggest that further investigation is warranted before any final judgment is rendered." "Further investigation has already been conducted," the magistrate replied firmly. "I am satisfied that the evidence presented conclusively establishes the Duchess of Ashcomb's legitimate claim to her family's inheritance. This matter is settled, pending final documentation to be completed within the fortnight." The crowd's attention shifted increasingly toward Edmund, whispers of suspicion and judgment now directed at him rather than at Adelina, a complete reversal of the social dynamic that had characterized her circumstances for months. Edmund, sensing the shift in public opinion, retreated from the gathering with his solicitors trailing behind him, his earlier confidence entirely dissolved beneath the weight of public exposure. "It is done," Cassian said quietly, once the immediate commotion had settled and the court's attention moved on to other matters. "Your inheritance will be restored, and your stepbrother's deceptions, have been exposed before the very court whose opinion he sought to manipulate against you. Adelina felt a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and lingering anxiety, uncertain whether Edmund would truly accept this defeat or continue seeking ways to undermine her reclaimed standing through less legitimate means. "Do you believe he will simply accept this outcome?" she asked. Cassian's expression grew thoughtful, his earlier confidence tempered by genuine concern. "Men like your stepbrother rarely accept defeat gracefully," he admitted. "We should remain vigilant, particularly given the public humiliation he has just experienced. Desperate men, exposed before their peers, often resort to increasingly reckless actions." As they departed the gathering later that evening, Adelina's mind remained troubled despite the victory they had just secured. Aware that Edmund's carefully cultivated facade of respectability had been shattered before the entire court, and uncertain what desperate measures he might pursue in response to such a devastating public defeat. "Whatever comes next," Cassian said, as their carriage made its way back toward Ravenswood Hall, through the quiet, snow-covered countryside, "we will face it together. I promise you that." Adelina reached out, taking his hand in hers, a gesture that would have felt impossibly forward mere months earlier, but now felt entirely natural, given everything they had endured together in pursuit of justice against her stepbrother's cruelty. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me, and for fighting alongside me when I had no one else to turn to." Cassian's fingers tightened gently around hers, his expression softening in the dim carriage light. "You give me too much credit," he said. "You are the one who survived everything your stepbrother inflicted upon you, who found the strength to fight for justice, despite having every reason to simply give up. I have merely provided the resources necessary to see that justice properly served." As their carriage continued through the darkness, snow falling gently outside the windows, Adelina found herself hoping, despite the lingering uncertainty regarding Edmund's next move, that the worst of their battles had finally been won, and that whatever challenges remained ahead, they would face them together, bound not merely by their practical arrangement, but by something far deeper that had grown steadily between them since that fateful night in the storm. Edmund's public humiliation before the royal court did not, as Cassian had predicted, result in quiet acceptance of his defeat. Instead, it seemed to ignite within him a desperate determination to reclaim whatever standing he had lost, regardless of the methods required to achieve it. The first indication of his continued scheming arrived nearly 3 weeks after the court's ruling, when Percival arrived at Ravenswood Hall bearing troubling news gathered through his network of contacts within the capital. "Your stepbrother has been meeting privately with several of his creditors," Percival explained, spreading a series of documents across Cassian's desk. "It appears he accumulated significant debts in the months since stealing your inheritance, debts he had intended to settle using funds now legally restored to you. With that avenue closed to him, he has begun seeking alternative means of raising capital." "What sort of alternative means?" Cassian asked, his expression darkening with the same protective intensity Adelina had come to recognize whenever discussions turned toward Edmund's continued schemes. "That remains unclear," Percival admitted, "though my contacts suggest he has been in correspondence with several individuals of questionable reputation, men known for facilitating transactions that would not withstand close legal scrutiny." Adelina felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her chest. "Do you believe he intends further action against us directly?" "I believe," Percival said carefully, "that a man as desperate as your stepbrother has become is capable of increasingly reckless decisions. I would recommend heightened caution, particularly regarding your movements beyond the estate grounds." Cassian's jaw tightened at Percival's warning, and he immediately called for increased security throughout Ravenswood Hall, additional guards stationed along the estate's perimeter, and careful monitoring of all visitors and correspondents arriving at the household. Adelina found herself grateful for his protective instincts, even as the constant vigilance began to weigh heavily on her spirits. "I hate feeling like a prisoner in my own home," she admitted one evening, as they sat together in the study, reviewing the latest reports from Percival's investigation into Edmund's activities. "I understand," Cassian said gently, "though I would rather endure temporary inconvenience than risk your safety, given the uncertainty surrounding your stepbrother's intentions." Despite the heightened security, weeks passed without further incident, and Adelina gradually began to hope that Edmund's schemes, whatever they had been, had ultimately come to nothing, perhaps abandoned in favor of simply accepting his diminished circumstances and moving forward with whatever remained of his reputation. That hope proved premature. The incident occurred on a clear winter evening, nearly 2 months after the court's ruling, when Adelina had ventured into the small village near Ravenswood Hall to purchase supplies for a charitable initiative she had begun organizing for families struggling through the harsh winter months. She traveled with only a single guard for protection, having grown perhaps overly confident in the relative peace of recent weeks. As she made her way through the village square, a figure emerged suddenly from a narrow alley between 2 buildings, moving with a speed and purpose that immediately set her instincts on edge. It was not Edmund himself, she realized quickly, but a man she did not recognize, his face partially obscured by a heavy scarf against the winter chill. "Lady Ashcombe," the man said, his voice carrying an edge of menace that made her guard immediately step forward protectively. "Your husband's investigation into certain matters would be wise to cease, for your own safety and his." Before her guard could respond, the man had already retreated back into the shadows of the alley, disappearing before pursuit became possible. Adelina stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding with a fear she had not experienced since the night Edmund had first thrown her from her family home. "We must return to the estate immediately," her guard insisted, and Adelina did not argue, her earlier confidence in their relative safety shattered by the direct threat she had just witnessed. Cassian's reaction, upon hearing her account of the incident, was immediate and severe. "This cannot continue," he said, pacing his study with barely contained fury. "Your stepbrother has moved beyond mere legal maneuvering into direct threats against your safety. This will not be tolerated." "What do you intend to do?" Adelina asked, still shaken by the encounter. "I intend," Cassian said, his voice cold with determination, "to ensure Edmund Voss faces consequences severe enough that he abandons any further schemes against you permanently, whatever measures that requires." Over the following days, Cassian worked closely with Percival and several of his most trusted contacts within the Royal Guard to trace the man who had threatened Adelina back to his origins, eventually discovering a clear connection to Edmund himself, payment records, and correspondence that left little doubt regarding who had orchestrated the threat. "We have him," Percival announced, triumphantly, presenting the evidence to Cassian and Adelina together. "This connects your stepbrother directly to threats against a Duchess of the Realm, a crime that carries severe legal consequences, regardless of his social standing." "Then we should proceed immediately," Cassian said, "before he has opportunity to flee or destroy further evidence of his schemes." The following morning, accompanied by royal guards bearing warrants for Edmund's arrest, Cassian rode toward the estate Edmund had claimed through his fraudulent inheritance, determined to see justice finally served against the man who had caused Adelina so much suffering. Adelina insisted on accompanying him, despite Cassian's initial reluctance to expose her to potential danger. "I need to see this through to its conclusion," she insisted. "I have fought too long and endured too much to remain hidden away while justice is finally served." Cassian relented, though he remained close beside her throughout the journey, his protective instincts clearly heightened by recent events. When they arrived at the estate, they found it in a state of apparent disarray, servants hurrying about with expressions of confusion and concern. "Where is Edmund Voss?" Cassian demanded of the estate's steward, who appeared visibly nervous at the sight of royal guards accompanying the Duke. "He departed early this morning, Your Grace," the steward stammered. "He said only that urgent business required his immediate attention elsewhere, though he did not specify his destination." Cassian's expression darkened further. "He has fled, aware that his schemes have finally been exposed beyond any possibility of continued deception." A thorough search of Edmund's estate revealed additional evidence of his desperate financial situation, debts far exceeding what Percival had originally estimated, along with correspondence confirming his involvement in the threat made against Adelina in the village. It became clear that Edmund had anticipated eventual exposure and had prepared contingencies for exactly this scenario. "We will find him," Cassian assured Adelina as they reviewed the gathered evidence together that evening. A man in his desperate circumstances, without resources or allies remaining to assist him, cannot evade justice indefinitely. True to Cassian's prediction, word arrived within days that Edmund had been apprehended attempting to cross into a neighboring territory, his attempt at flight thwarted by the very network of contacts Percival had cultivated throughout the investigation. He was returned to face formal charges before the royal court, his fraudulent claims against Adelina's inheritance now compounded by additional charges of threatening a member of the nobility and attempting to evade justice. The trial proceeded swiftly, the evidence against Edmund overwhelming and largely undisputed given his own incriminating correspondence and the testimony of witnesses who had observed his desperate scheming in the weeks following his public humiliation before the court. Adelina attended each session, watching as the man who had once controlled every aspect of her existence finally faced consequences for the cruelty he had inflicted upon her. Edmund Voss, the presiding magistrate, announced, once all evidence had been presented and testimony concluded, "This court finds you guilty of fraud, forgery, and threatening the safety of a member of the nobility. You are hereby stripped of all remaining claims to the Voss family fortune and sentenced to permanent exile from these lands, effective immediately." Edmund's expression, throughout the reading of his sentence, remained a mask of barely suppressed rage, though he offered no further protest, apparently recognizing the futility of continued resistance given the overwhelming evidence against him. As guards escorted him from the courtroom to begin the process of his exile, he cast one final glance toward Adelina, an expression that held neither remorse nor acceptance, merely the bitter recognition of complete and total defeat. "It is finally over," Cassian said quietly, as they watched Edmund's departure from the courtroom, his hand resting reassuringly at the small of her back. "Whatever threat he posed to your safety and happiness has been permanently addressed." Adelina felt the weight of months of fear and uncertainty finally beginning to lift from her shoulders, replaced by a cautious sense of hope for the future that stretched ahead of her, a future she would face not alone, as she had feared during that desperate night in the storm, but alongside a man who had proven himself far more than the cold, distant duke his reputation suggested. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him fully, "for everything you have done to see justice finally served." Cassian's expression softened into something Adelina had come to recognize as uniquely hers, an expression reserved only for their private moments together, gentle and warm, in ways that would have shocked anyone familiar only with his public reputation as the Iron Duke. "There is no need for thanks," he said quietly. "Protecting you has become as natural to me as breathing, Adelina. I only wish I could have prevented your suffering entirely, rather than merely addressing it after the fact." As they departed the courtroom together, leaving behind the final chapter of Edmund's cruel schemes, Adelina found herself looking toward the future with a hope and optimism she had not believed possible during those darkest days following her exile into the storm, grateful beyond measure for the unexpected turn of fate that had brought Cassian Thorne riding into her life precisely when she needed him most. Spring arrived at Ravenswood Hall with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the harsh winter that had defined the beginning of Adelina's life within its walls. The snow melted gradually from the surrounding fields, revealing the first green shoots of new growth, and the household staff moved through their duties with a lightness that reflected the general sense of relief following Edmund's exile and the resolution of the legal battles that had consumed so much of the preceding months. Yet even as external threats to their safety and happiness had been resolved, Adelina found herself increasingly aware of an internal struggle within Cassian that remained unaddressed, a lingering grief and guardedness that seemed to resist the gradual warming of their relationship, much as the last patches of stubborn snow resisted the spring thaw in shadowed corners of the estate grounds. She discovered the source of this resistance quite by accident one afternoon, having wandered into a rarely used wing of Ravenswood Hall while exploring the estate's extensive gardens through a series of interior passages she had not previously traveled. There, in a small chamber that had clearly been sealed away for years, she found what could only have been intended as a nursery, complete with a small crib carved from fine wood and gentle murals depicting forest creatures painted across the walls, all covered now in a thin layer of dust that spoke of long abandonment. "You should not be in here." Adelina turned to find Cassian standing in the doorway, his expression stricken in a way she had rarely witnessed, even during their most difficult confrontations with Edmund's schemes. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I did not know this room existed. I was simply exploring the estate." Cassian's gaze moved slowly around the room, taking in details that clearly held painful significance for him. memories he had apparently kept carefully locked away, much like the room itself. "This was meant for my son," he said finally, his voice quiet and strained. "Isabel and I prepared it together during her pregnancy, before everything went wrong." Adelina remained silent, sensing that Cassian needed space to share this painful history at his own pace, rather than being pressed for details he was not yet ready to reveal. After a long moment, he continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke, though the pain beneath his words remained evident. "She went into labor nearly 2 months early," he said. "The physicians did everything within their power, but complications arose that could not be resolved. I lost them both within the same terrible night, Isabel and our son, taken from me in a matter of hours, after years of hoping and preparing for his arrival." "I am so sorry," Adelina said softly, moving closer, though maintaining enough distance to respect whatever boundaries he required in this moment of vulnerable disclosure. "I closed this room afterward," Cassian continued, "and told myself I would never allow myself to feel that depth of loss again. It seemed safer, somehow, to build walls around my heart, rather than risk experiencing such devastating grief a second time." Adelina understood, in that moment, the full depth of what Cassian had risked, in allowing himself to care for her, in permitting the walls he had constructed so carefully to begin crumbling, despite his best efforts to maintain them. "You do not have to fear that same outcome with me," she said gently. "I know that. Rationally," Cassian admitted, "yet the fear remains regardless of logic. Grief does not always respond to reasonable argument, however much I might wish it were otherwise." "Then perhaps," Adelina suggested carefully, "we need not rush toward anything beyond what feels safe for both of us. What we have built together thus far has already exceeded whatever practical arrangement we originally agreed upon. There is no need to force further steps before you feel genuinely ready." Cassian studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his dark eyes that suggested her words had touched something deep within him that he had not expected to encounter. "You continue to surprise me," he said finally. "Most people, upon learning of such personal grief, would offer empty reassurances or attempt to minimize the pain, rather than simply acknowledging it as you have done." "I have experienced my own losses," Adelina reminded him gently. "Perhaps not identical to yours, but significant enough that I understand grief does not simply disappear, because logic suggests it should. My mother's death, my father's betrayal through Edmund's schemes, even my own sense of identity, stripped away in a single afternoon. I understand, in my own way, what it means to carry pain that does not fully heal, however much time passes." Something in her words seemed to reach him in a way that mere reassurance could not have accomplished, and Cassian moved closer, taking her hands gently in his own, a gesture of genuine affection rather than the practical partnership that had characterized their early interactions. "I find myself caring for you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "far more deeply than I anticipated when I first proposed our arrangement. It frightens me, if I am entirely honest, given everything I have lost before."
"It frightens me as well," Adelina confessed. "But I would rather face that fear alongside you than retreat into safety that leaves us both isolated and alone."
They stood together in the abandoned nursery, hands clasped, surrounded by evidence of Cassian's deepest grief. Yet somehow, within that shared vulnerability, Adelina sensed a genuine turning point in their relationship, a moment where practical arrangement began to transform fully into something far more meaningful. "Perhaps," Cassian said eventually, glancing around the dusty room with an expression that had shifted from pain towards something more contemplative, "it is time this room served a purpose again, rather than remaining a monument to grief alone." "Only when you feel ready," Adelina said quickly. "There is no need to rush such decisions." "I am beginning to understand," Cassian replied, "that some things cannot be rushed, but they also cannot remain frozen indefinitely, lest we lose opportunities for genuine happiness out of fear alone." He looked at her then, with an expression of such open vulnerability that Adelina felt her heart constrict with tenderness. "I do not wish to spend the remainder of my life hiding from feeling, Adelina, however much easier that path might initially appear." In the weeks that followed this quiet revelation, Adelina noticed gradual but genuine changes in Cassian's demeanor throughout Ravenswood Hall. He laughed more frequently, small moments of genuine humor emerging during their evening conversations that had been entirely absent during the early months of their arrangement. He sought her company not merely for practical discussions regarding estate matters or lingering concerns about Edmund's exile, but simply for the pleasure of her presence, walks through the gardens as spring flowers began to bloom, quiet evenings spent reading together in comfortable silence, rather than the careful distance that had once characterized their interactions. Mrs. Whitfield, observing these changes with evident satisfaction, remarked one afternoon, as she assisted Adelina with preparations for a small gathering they intended to host, that she had not witnessed the Duke this content since long before Isabel's tragic passing. "You have brought something back to this household that we feared had been lost forever," Mrs. Whitfield said, her eyes glistening slightly with emotion. "Genuine warmth, genuine joy. Whatever practical reasons brought you together initially, I believe fate had far grander plans in store for you both." Adelina found herself increasingly inclined to agree with the housekeeper's sentiment, watching as Cassian gradually allowed himself to experience genuine happiness again, watching as the Iron Duke's carefully constructed walls continued crumbling, not through force or pressure, but through patient understanding and shared vulnerability that had grown naturally between them since that fateful night in the storm nearly a year earlier. Yet even as their relationship deepened into something increasingly genuine and meaningful, a nagging sense of unease continued to linger at the edges of Adelina's contentment, an awareness that Edmund's exile, however thoroughly enforced, might not represent the final chapter in the story of his cruelty and desperation. She pushed these concerns aside as best she could, choosing instead to focus on the genuine happiness gradually blossoming between herself and Cassian, though some small part of her remained cautiously vigilant, aware that peace, however welcome, often proved more fragile than one might wish to believe. The letter arrived without warning on a quiet afternoon in early summer, delivered not through official channels, but slipped beneath the kitchen door by an unknown hand sometime during the night, discovered only when one of the younger kitchen staff found it while sweeping the floor before dawn. Mrs. Whitfield brought it directly to Cassian's study, her expression troubled enough that Adelina, who happened to be present discussing garden plans with her husband, immediately sensed something was deeply wrong. Cassian read through the letter in silence, his expression growing increasingly grim with each line, and when he finally looked up, Adelina saw genuine fear behind his dark eyes for the first time since she had known him. "What is it?" she asked, her own anxiety mounting rapidly. "Edmund has broken the terms of his exile," Cassian said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This letter claims he has returned to the county in secret, and that he intends to reclaim what he considers rightfully his, whatever measures that requires." "Does he make specific threats?" Adelina asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer given Cassian's expression. "He threatens to take you," Cassian said bluntly, "to hold you until I agree to relinquish claim to your inheritance, and provide him with sufficient resources to establish himself elsewhere beyond the reach of royal justice." Adelina felt the blood drain from her face, old fears resurfacing with sudden, visceral intensity. Memories of that first terrible night when Edmund had stripped away everything she had once believed secure in her life. How could he have returned undetected? Surely the terms of his exile included monitoring of his movements. "Clearly our vigilance was insufficient," Cassian said grimly, already moving toward the door to summon additional guards. "I will not allow him to harm you, Adelina. Whatever measures are required to ensure your safety, I will see them implemented immediately." Over the following hours, Ravenswood Hall transformed once again into a fortress of heightened security, additional guards stationed throughout the grounds, careful monitoring of all entrances and exits, and messages dispatched to Percival and the Royal Guard, requesting immediate assistance in tracking down Edmund's location before he could act on his stated intentions. Yet despite these precautions, Edmund proved himself once again capable of desperate cunning that exceeded their expectations. 3 days after the initial threatening letter arrived, while Adelina walked through the estate's private garden, accompanied by only a single guard, having grown perhaps too confident in the security Cassian had established, a group of men emerged suddenly from the surrounding hedges, moving with coordinated precision that suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous action. Her guard fought valiantly, but found himself outnumbered, and before Adelina could flee toward the safety of the main house, rough hands seized her, a cloth soaked in some pungent substance pressed briefly against her face, before darkness claimed her senses entirely. She awoke sometime later in an unfamiliar room, her wrists bound and her head throbbing painfully from whatever substance had rendered her unconscious. Dim light filtered through a single small window, suggesting either early morning or late evening, though she could not be certain given her disorientation. "Finally awake, I see." Edmund's voice, unmistakable despite the passage of months since she had last heard it directly, sent a chill through her entire body. He emerged from the shadows of the small room, his appearance considerably rougher than she remembered, evidence of the difficult circumstances his exile and subsequent desperate schemes had forced upon him. "You will not escape justice this time," Adelina said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Cassian will find you, wherever you have hidden me. Your husband," Edmund replied with a bitter laugh, "will do exactly as I instruct, once he receives my demands. He values your safety far too highly to risk defying me, whatever resources he might otherwise employ to track my location." "What do you want?" Adelina demanded. "What I have always wanted," Edmund said, his expression hardening with the same calculated cruelty she remembered from the night he had first betrayed her. "The fortune that should have been mine, along with sufficient additional resources to establish myself somewhere beyond the reach of royal justice, where I can rebuild my life without the constant shadow of your husband's investigations." He departed shortly afterward, leaving her alone in the small room with only her fear and determination for company. Adelina worked at her bindings throughout the following hours, testing the strength of the ropes and searching for any weakness she might exploit to secure her own freedom, rather than relying entirely on rescue from outside. Meanwhile, at Ravenswood Hall, Cassian's reaction to Adelina's disappearance bordered on barely controlled devastation, years of carefully maintained composure crumbling entirely beneath the weight of fear for her safety. He mobilized every resource at his disposal, summoning Nathaniel Vane from the border garrison, coordinating with Percival and the Royal Guard to trace any evidence of Edmund's location. "We will find her," Nathaniel assured him, though his own expression betrayed genuine concern given the severity of the situation. "Edmund cannot have traveled far, particularly given the speed with which we mobilized our search." Edmund's ransom letter arrived within a day, confirming Cassian's worst fears regarding his brother-in-law's intentions, demanding an enormous sum along with guaranteed safe passage beyond the realm's borders, in exchange for Adelina's safe return. Cassian read through the demands with barely controlled fury, immediately beginning preparations to meet Edmund's terms, while simultaneously coordinating covert efforts to trace the location from which the letter had been sent. "We cannot simply trust him to honor these terms, even if we comply," Percival cautioned, as they reviewed the ransom letter together late into the night. "A man desperate enough to resort to such measures may not honor any agreement, regardless of what we offer." "I am aware," Cassian said grimly, "which is why we must locate her precise location before any exchange takes place, ensuring we can act decisively, regardless of whether Edmund intends to honor his own demands." Through careful investigation, tracing the messenger who had delivered Edmund's ransom letter back to his point of origin, Cassian's forces eventually identified an abandoned hunting lodge several miles beyond the county's borders, isolated enough to explain how Edmund had evaded initial searches, yet close enough that swift action remained possible. Meanwhile, Adelina had made progress of her own, having finally worked one hand free from her bindings during a period when her captor's attention had wandered elsewhere. She waited for an opportune moment, when the single guard stationed outside her door grew careless with fatigue, before slipping free from the room entirely and making her way through the unfamiliar lodge in search of any avenue of escape. She had nearly reached what appeared to be a side entrance when Edmund himself intercepted her path, his expression a mixture of fury and desperation that made her blood run cold. "You will not escape so easily," he said, seizing her arm with bruising force. "Let go of me," Adelina demanded, struggling against his grip with every ounce of strength she possessed. It was at that precise moment, as their struggle continued near the lodge's entrance, that Cassian arrived with a contingent of royal guards, having tracked Edmund's location through the careful investigation his forces had conducted throughout the preceding day. The sight of Cassian storming through the entrance, his expression carrying a fury Adelina had never before witnessed from him, gave her the surge of hope needed to intensify her struggle against Edmund's grip. "Release her," Cassian commanded, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Several guards already moving to surround Edmund with weapons drawn. Edmund, recognizing the futility of continued resistance, given the overwhelming force now arrayed against him, released Adelina's arm and raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, though his expression remained one of bitter defiance rather than genuine remorse for his actions. "This changes nothing," he spat, as guards moved to restrain him properly. "I will simply find another way to reclaim what is rightfully mine." "You will find nothing," Cassian said coldly, "beyond the confines of whatever prison awaits you following this latest crime. Kidnapping a Duchess of the Realm carries consequences far more severe than mere exile, Edmund. This time, there will be no escape from justice." As guards led Edmund away in restraints, Cassian turned immediately to Adelina, his expression shifting from cold fury toward genuine tenderness and relief as he gathered her carefully into his arms, checking for any injury she might have sustained during her ordeal. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered to conceal. "I am unharmed," Adelina assured him, though she found herself trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, adrenaline giving way to the full weight of everything she had endured over the preceding day. "I was so afraid," Cassian admitted, holding her close against his chest, as though reluctant to release her even momentarily. "When I discovered you had been taken, I feared I might lose you entirely, much as I lost Isabel all those years ago." "You did not lose me," Adelina said softly, pulling back slightly to meet his gaze directly. "I am here, safe, because you refused to give up searching for me." As they made their way back toward Ravenswood Hall together, Edmund secured under heavy guard for transport to face the far more severe consequences his latest crime demanded, Adelina found herself reflecting on how completely her circumstances had transformed since that terrible night when she had first collapsed in the snow, abandoned by everyone she had once trusted. Now, having survived Edmund's final desperate scheme, she understood with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, she would face them alongside a man who had proven, time and again, that his devotion to her safety and happiness ran far deeper than either of them had initially anticipated when their arrangement began as nothing more than a practical transaction. Edmund's trial for the kidnapping of a duchess proceeded with remarkable speed, the Crown's justice system moving swiftly, given the severity of his offense and the overwhelming evidence gathered against him, including testimony from the men he had hired for the abduction, who proved eager to cooperate with authorities once faced with the full weight of consequences for their participation in such a serious crime. Adelina attended the proceedings alongside Cassian, watching as the man who had once controlled every aspect of her existence finally faced the complete and total collapse of whatever schemes he had hoped might restore his fortune and reputation. When the presiding magistrate delivered his final sentence, condemning Edmund to lifelong imprisonment rather than mere exile, given the severity of kidnapping a member of the nobility, Adelina felt a profound sense of closure settle over her, the last remnants of fear that had lingered since that terrible night in the storm finally beginning to dissolve entirely. "It is truly finished now," she said, as they departed the courtroom for what she hoped would be the final time in relation to Edmund's crimes. "It is," Cassian confirmed, his hand finding hers as they walked together toward their waiting carriage. "Whatever remains of your stepbrother's schemes has been permanently addressed. You need not fear him further." The months that followed brought a peace to Ravenswood Hall that Adelina had scarcely dared to imagine possible during those darkest early days of her arrival, half frozen and abandoned by everyone she had once trusted. Cassian continued his gradual transformation from the cold, distant duke his reputation had once suggested into a man capable of genuine warmth and open affection. The walls he had constructed following Isabel's death finally dismantled entirely, rather than merely cracked. One particular afternoon, several months after Edmund's final trial and sentencing, Cassian found Adelina in the gardens that had become her favorite retreat within the estate, tending to flowers she had planted herself in the weeks following her recovery from the kidnapping ordeal. He approached with an expression she had come to recognize as reserved specifically for their most intimate moments together, gentle and open, in ways that would have shocked anyone familiar only with his public reputation. "I have been considering something," he said, settling onto the bench beside her, regarding the nursery we discovered together, all those months ago. Adelina's heart quickened slightly at the reference to that painful, vulnerable conversation they had shared. "What have you been considering?" "I believe," Cassian said carefully, "that room has remained a monument to grief for far too long. I would like to see it transformed into something that celebrates hope for the future, rather than merely commemorating loss from the past." Adelina understood immediately the deeper significance behind his words, and she took his hand gently, searching his expression for confirmation of what she suspected he was suggesting. "Are you saying what I believe you are saying?" Cassian's expression softened further, genuine emotion evident in his dark eyes, in a manner that would have been entirely foreign to the guarded man she had first encountered nearly 2 years earlier. "I am saying," he confirmed, "that I am ready to move forward, fully and without reservation, toward whatever future we might build together. I love you, Adelina, more deeply than I believed myself capable of loving anyone again after Isabel's passing. I would be honored if you would consider expanding our family together when you feel ready." Tears gathered in Adelina's eyes, though these carried none of the sorrow that had characterized so many tears shed during her earlier struggles, instead reflecting only profound joy and gratitude for the unexpected turn her life had taken since that terrible night in the storm. "I love you as well," she said softly, "more than I ever anticipated when we first agreed to our practical arrangement. I would be honored to build a family with you, Cassian." Their embrace that afternoon, surrounded by the flowers Adelina had cultivated with her own hands, marked a turning point that neither of them had fully anticipated when their story began. Two damaged souls, brought together by circumstance and gradually transformed by patience, understanding, and genuine devotion into something far more meaningful than either had originally sought. In the years that followed, Ravenswood Hall transformed entirely from the quiet, somber estate it had been during Cassian's years of isolated grief into a home filled with genuine warmth and laughter. The nursery that had once stood as a painful reminder of loss eventually welcomed new life. First a daughter, with her mother's gentle spirit and determined courage, followed several years later by a son who inherited his father's steady strength, tempered by the warmth Adelina had helped restore to his character. Mrs. Whitfield, who remained a beloved presence throughout the household for many years afterward, often remarked to visitors that she had never witnessed such a complete transformation as she had observed within Cassian Thorne following Adelina's arrival, from a man frozen by grief into someone capable of genuine joy and open affection, proof that even the coldest exteriors could thaw, given sufficient patience and genuine care. Adelina herself never forgot the terror of that first night, abandoned in the storm by everyone she had once trusted, nor did she forget the profound gratitude she felt toward the man who had refused to ride past a stranger dying in the snow, choosing instead to risk his own carefully guarded heart in service of a compassion he had believed himself no longer capable of feeling. Their story, which had begun with abandonment and near tragedy, had transformed gradually into one of genuine partnership, mutual healing, and eventually, profound love that neither had anticipated when circumstance first brought them together. Years later, when their own children asked about how their parents had first met, Cassian would often smile, an expression that came easily to him now, so different from the guarded severity that had once defined his public reputation, and tell them simply that their mother had taught him something he had believed impossible, following years of carefully maintained isolation, that even the most guarded heart could learn to love again, given the right person and sufficient courage to risk vulnerability once more. Adelina, for her part, would add that sometimes the darkest storms led unexpectedly toward the greatest blessings, that abandonment and betrayal, however painful in the moment, had ultimately led her toward a life filled with genuine love and belonging that she could scarcely have imagined possible during those desperate hours she had spent freezing in the snow, certain that her story was about to end in tragedy rather than the beginning of something far more meaningful than she had ever dared to hope. Their love, forged through shared adversity and gradual mutual healing, stood as testament to the possibility that even the coldest circumstances could give way to genuine warmth, that even the most guarded hearts could learn to trust again, and that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings led toward the most profound and lasting happiness two people could hope to share together throughout the remainder of their lives.